So today we're going to be talking about how we can create a representative industry. And we have Katie, who is Head of Accessibility at Pride London, Rachel, who is Director of Operations and Head of Diversity at UK Music, and Alexandra, who is Promoter at Metropolis Music and Diversity Leader. So I think just to start, we're going to give a very brief introduction into the types of exclusion and the groups that lack representation. So maybe Rachel, you could just give us an introduction.
Sure. So at UK Music, every 2 years we run a diversity survey and we put it out across the workforce of the industry to gather statistics, see where we're at, see where we're improving, see where work still needs to be done. And the primary areas that we look at through that are gender and ethnicity. So that kind of makes up the bulk of what we publish in our diversity report. The last report that we published came out in October 2020. So we look at ethnicity and career level, ethnicity and age, gender and career level, gender and age, income, both for men and women and for people from diverse backgrounds. This year we've also opened it up and we've published more than ever. We've published data on disability and sexual orientation. So, those are the kind of key protected characteristics of the things that we primarily look at. And what we found is that at entry level, at apprentice level and entry level, things are getting a lot better. They're improving year on year. And then you get up to mid-level, you get up to senior level, and that representation just kind of drops, and it kind of mirrors both for women and for people from diverse backgrounds. Things are improving. They seem to be improving slowly, but there are obviously still barriers. So, those are, I'd say, the primary areas. Disability is obviously a huge one as well, and one that I don't think is spoken about enough, and I'll hold my hands up, we don't do enough work on it, is class. A lot of jobs in the industry are, especially entry level, quite low pay. And if you don't have support, that can be a really massive barrier to entry into the music industry. Those are the kind of key areas that we look at in terms of data and best practice and that kind of thing.
So of course, not all disabilities not all disabilities or forms of exclusion are as common. And so, Katie, there are lots of considerations that people don't always think about. So how do we tackle those specific issues?
I think the easiest answer would be to hire a consultancy at a company to get someone in, because unless you have those people with that industry knowledge, that expert knowledge, and who talk to the people who are using the services, who get people who use the services in to test like a ramp or a hearing loop, or people who rely on quiet spaces, to have those people in and give their direct feedback. It really, personally, I think that is the best way of making sure you're talking to the people that need it.
And so, Alex, we briefly talked about some of the new technologies, and this is going to be hopefully an area which will hopefully be one of the positives that we can take away from the virus and the pandemic. And what are these new technologies that are promoting and facilitating better inclusion at events?
Some of the new technologies that we've been exploring are live streaming and taking things online. So I guess having that available to people who, to make it more accessible, people who can't maybe have kids or have disabilities that don't allow them to come to the venues as easy as people who are able-bodied. We've been exploring a lot of that, so I think that's made things more accessible, and it sounds weird to say a positive has come from the virus, but that's one of the things that we have noticed, so yeah.
So you mentioned, for instance, Zoom, and how does that open up to audiences that previously maybe would never have been able to attend? With Zoom calls, for instance, or video broadcasting, and also you mentioned about the subtitles.
Yeah. So with Zoom, you can have it's transcribed, and that's something that's also helped people who struggle with hearing and have to have some kind of impairments. So that's something that's really good, because a lot of people need subtitles, and it's something that we don't even consider in our just day-to-day lives, especially if you're not someone who suffers with any kind of impairment that way. So that's something that we've been utilising with our stuff that we've been doing on Zoom, not only in our meetings but training and workshops.
And so listening to the stakeholders and the individuals that are affected is, of course, one of the key ways to understand. But how do you use what are the methods used, Katie, for gathering that feedback? So you mentioned about gathering feedback and listening to the parties that are involved. What are the methods used?
So when we first went into lockdown and I was sat twiddling my thumbs, I created endless questionnaires just for my own personal resources to try and gather in as much information as possible. But literally just opening up the communication channels to make sure that we are listening to the people that are trying to access these services. So I am a huge fan of questionnaires. I love them, and I feel like they give you so much. They give people who attend the events the opportunity to kind of voice what they need or they want. And yeah, personally, I love a questionnaire, but I also find it really important on the day of the event, when not if, but make sure it's a priority that the people that are around, the customers that are there that want to give you feedback, because they're lingering, they see someone somewhat professional and they're like, I want to talk to you, I have something to say. And to try and get the negative, because people love giving the negative comments straight away, but also the positive of what we're doing well and what we could improve on. Just the communication channels.
Absolutely. And you mentioned also previously when we talked about focus groups. And so how important are questionnaires and focus groups, and how do they work together?
I think they are vital. They are, personally, working on disabled access, I don't think you can work in it without having those focus groups and speaking to those people. Whatever kind of group that you're trying to target, whether it be the deaf community, whether it be the community who use wheelchair, literally every kind of disability, you'll find on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram a little group of people that are all in that same community, that have voices that they would like to be heard, and they're not often, unfortunately. So I think that is really, really important.
Absolutely. And Rachel, how do you create events that make each and every single attendee feel included, or what are the steps, what can be done?
An event, sorry.
Can be done to make every person feel included at events, to best try?
That's a good question. So we work very closely with a charity called Attitude is Everything, and they are kind of the leaders on disability in the industry. So they started out, they've been going for 21 years now, so they've been doing this for a really long time, and they kind of started out looking at the audience experience, so kind of pushing for more, wheelchair platforms at festivals, focusing very heavily on making sure that the ticket buying process is accessible, because that often, might not be accessible for someone. Making sure that someone with a disability who needs a personal assistant, that's a free ticket that they can get. They've also now moved into kind of the workforce arena as well. They've just published a really great guide on making the workplace more inclusive. And then kind of beyond disability as well, I think, there's been a lot of conversations in the last year about, everything with Black Lives Matter and everything that happened after the sad murder of Sarah Everard, about making women feel safe, about making people of colour feel safe. And I think it's just, it's quite trite, but the name of that charity, Attitude is Everything, is kind of the key thing. It's, it's that everyone that's working at the event is going into it with kind of understanding of the fact that their experience might not be what their colleagues are experiencing, the people that are attending the event, making sure that there's, a system in place. When you go into a pub toilet and there's the Ask Angela thing, those kind of safe space systems, they're quite easy to set up. It's training staff, making sure that staff are aware of things that might be happening, how to deal with situations like that. So I think, there's a lot of different ways of looking at it, of whether or not you're looking at the people working the event, the people on stage, the people that are attending. But I think it's just kind of being aware of someone's situation that isn't necessarily going to be the same as your own. And there's so many resources out there that can help you create that environment that's kind of inclusive and welcoming and safe for everybody involved.
I absolutely agree. And of course, when we're talking about inclusion in events, it's always going to be a bit two-sided, because there's of course the event team and then there's the people who are attending. And I guess it's key to have inclusion within the event team, because if you don't even have it within the event team, it's never going to come through at the events. But of course, a big problem is stereotypes and biases. So Alex, what are some of the ways we can overcome stereotypes and biases?
I'd say just having an open dialogue is one of the key things, because a lot of the time things are not even spoken about. If you're going through something or you notice something happening with your colleague, it kind of goes over your head and you might not feel comfortable saying, talking about something that you've seen. So to overcome biases and stereotypes, I really feel like having that open dialogue and just saying, okay, this is what I'm going through, this is what I've seen happening in the workplace, how can we change that? And taking proactive steps towards making sure that the workplace is inclusive, not only for your colleagues, but for the people who are, like you said, attending events.
Absolutely. And of course, people need to be having these conversations and people need to be held accountable. So to promote better diversity with event teams, who should be accountable for that? Exactly.
That question, I've had that question before, and I think it's everyone's responsibility. It's not, obviously from the top down it will work a little better because you have to report to someone, but everyone should be accountable. If you see something happening, speak up about it. If you feel like you can implement something a little better where you work, speak to your boss about it, and hopefully they're receptive. And if they're not, then you go higher up.
Yeah, and perhaps Rachel, you could also talk a little bit about how change needs to be instigated and how that's done.
Yeah, so the accountability question, kind of following on from that. So in the diversity report that we put out in October, there was a 10-point plan that was written by our diversity task force, which is 10, obviously, points that kind of look at various things across the spectrum of diversity and inclusion, all with smart targets with time that we've got time deadlines against all of them, and they kind of range from the first one is dropping the term BAME and the term urban from any kind of communication, internal or external. Second one is a database of everyone. So all of our members at UK Music have signed up to this, and we now have a database of who's responsible for diversity work and who's accountable. And the accountability is generally they're the CEOs of these organisations, because that's ultimately where the buck stops with this kind of thing. And then it kind of ranges from, there's things in there about recruitment, there's things in there about training, partnering with socially conscious organisations, to increase education. And then ultimately the last one is an ambitious sort of plan to reform the boards of these organisations. So Nadia Khan, who runs a great organisation called Women in Control, put out a report last year called Seat at the Table, which looked at the trade bodies and their boards and the diversity on those boards, and it was wasn't great. So our organisations our members have signed up to and committed to getting 50-50 gender parity on those boards and 30% representation of people from diverse backgrounds. So, it's ambitious. It's the trade bodies have signed up to it. I know that there are other companies within the music industry that are using that plan as a starting point of things to look at, and things that they can improve on to try and drive this change. And it's not going to happen overnight, obviously, particularly when you're looking at things like staff retention, promotion, that kind of thing, those things don't happen automatically. And as we continue to do the survey every 2 years, the hope is that increase that we're seeing at entry level is going to, start showing up in mid and senior level eventually. But you can start driving change in really small ways. So, I check out our 10-point plan. I'd look at attitude as everything's plan. And I think education as well. It's a huge part of it is education. It doesn't even need to be formal, it's just listening to what people around you are saying. So I did a panel for a publishing company on International Women's Day. And one of the things that I talked about was we did some focus groups 2 years ago, and we did ones for women in the industry. And in both the focus groups, they came up with the football chat. Like, all the men are talking about football, they're going to the football, and it's like, I just don't feel included in it, and I feel like I'm not building that rapport with my seniors, and then it's them that get the promotion. And a lot of men on the call were like, oh, like I didn't think that was a thing. I didn't think it was a big deal. And so it's just like, listening to the women, all the people from diverse backgrounds, all the disabled people, all the LGBTQ people in your team, in your organization, in your life, and helping them drive change. Like, it's great that this is an all-female panel, but it would have been kind of good, the buck shouldn't stop with, it shouldn't be our responsibility to make things better for women, and it shouldn't be the responsibility of people from diverse backgrounds to make things better for those people in the industry. So it's everyone has to do this together and listen and learn and grow and drive that change.
Absolutely. That's something that yesterday was brought up at one of the panel discussions. It was David, I forget his last name, but he works for NFL, and he was saying that it's actions that he took, raising it with his superiors, and he managed to instigate 10% of everyone's annual goals is around inclusion. So I just thought that was absolutely incredible, and something that for such a big company to be leading by example, that really was a way to hold people accountable, to motivate people. But this is a question that I'd like to ask you, Katie, about how do you speak to people? What's the language that you use? How do you approach your managers, supervisors, the people who are able to make change?
I think that's a good question because, the language is definitely, when you're trying to take it higher, you're essentially trying to sell your ideas, right? And I feel like a lot, especially with things like PA tickets and things that initially, if you run higher up the ladder, it can often come back with like, that's going to cost us money, we're going to lose profit. And instead of, it's like the way that I try and sell my ideas anyway, is that to make people realize that you're actually opening up the doors to a whole new audience, because you are laying down the tools and the resources for those people to be able to use that and bring their friends and their PAs. And I understand that a PA ticket, when you initially look at it, you are losing money on a ticket, but you're actually opening the doors to all of those people that couldn't attend without a PA or without their carer. And I know I don't attend an event unless I can bring my PA, because my anxiety would just get too overwhelming, and this is fine. But it would get too overwhelming when there's thousands of people, and I don't know that I can get myself to a safe place to know that I can take someone who knows exactly what to do in that situation. It's not just me bringing in a friend. It's like that person that knows exactly what to do when I need her to do it, or him or whoever it's usually the same person because she knows. And it means that the amount of events that we go to because I can bring her, whereas if she's like, oh, I can't make it, or I know I can't afford to buy a ticket for her, she won't come, and then I won't go, and so then that's two people's food for the day, drinks for the day, merch for the day, like all of those, how do I word it, like all those sales for the day, because you've given that person that +1 ticket. You will in the long run make money, because I don't know about the other communities, but in the disabled access community, they're really outspoken amongst themselves. And so once we find an event that has really good accessibility, usually everyone there's word gets out, and then it really does snowball. I know one of the events that I work at every winter, just from 1 year to the next, we didn't even have to look at figures, because once we brought in the change in place and we made sure that it was just as accessible as it could be with the time constraints and the budget that we had at the time, the following year, people were coming up to me going, there's so many access customers this year. And I'm like, I know, because we've implemented the PA system, we've put in extra facilities, and you can see with your own eyes, without even looking at the numbers and the figures, how well it's worked. So if we do kind of open the platform, you have to spend money to make money. And personally, I can't shout about it enough, because it really does open up your customer database in who can attend and who will attend, because you have those provisions in place.
Absolutely. And of course, the events will evolve and grow, and they grow bigger that way. It's not just about on that day how many people are there. It's how the events are perceived, how they see themselves, how they are, and how it's going to move forwards. And progress won't happen if things aren't done and changes aren't made. And of course, people recognise that there are differences, but Alex, how would you challenge people to get out of their comfort zone and to tackle these issues to help make a difference?
It's a hard one, because there's so many people who are shy, maybe suffer with anxiety, don't feel comfortable coming out of their comfort zone. So for me, I always just try and make people feel as comfortable as possible, and speak to them about what their issues are. Like, what is it that's going to make you feel comfortable? Because I won't know until we have that conversation. So having to challenge those kind of things, and as an employer or a manager or all of that kind of stuff, you have to be able to digest the information that you received from your team. I think that's really important, and just you have to be accountable for your team, because nobody's going to have these conversations unless you push that forward and you champion that and spearhead that kind of movement.
And of course, change needs to happen, but Rachel, how do we create systemic change, and what's the difference between systemic change and people trying to do things and it not affecting the core of the event or the team or the company?
That's a good question. This wasn't one of my questions. So I think kind of some of the things that I touched on before, when it comes to kind of systemic changes and stuff, it's going to require people to take a really good, long look at themselves and probably face up to some truths about themselves that they don't like and are very uncomfortable, and it's going to involve a lot of very uncomfortable conversations, and that is just the nature of it. If you're going in and talking to someone about creating an actively anti-racist organisation, there's going to be some uncomfortable conversations that you're having there, because everyone has unconscious biases, everyone has that, everyone carries that. You like to think that you don't, but you absolutely do. Everyone does. And again, as I said before, it's just about listening and learning and doing some soul searching and figuring that out for yourself, where that lies, what you can do to do better, and then implementing that on a greater scale in your organisation or in your team, I think. And it will take time, but I've been doing the diversity stuff now for about a year and a half, and so I started in October 2019, and just the amount of people that have been getting in touch since a year ago, the appetite, it's incredibly sad that it took the murder of George Floyd to kind of drive people to do it. But unlike when things like this have happened before, the momentum, it feels like the momentum's still going, and people are so keen to learn and try and drive change, and you just have to hope that carries on and carries through, and that we are actually going to see something significant here. And there's a lot of people working to push that forward. So, I'm kind of quietly hopeful that we might see a strong change in the kind of coming years.
And so when talking about change and what is the data and the information that must be used to be a driving force to lead change?
So the data, obviously, that's a key part of that's why we do the survey every 2 years. It's the cornerstone of our report. Our sample size has increased every time we've done it, but obviously, last year it was 3,500, 4,000 people, and according to one of our other reports, the music industry employs 120,000 people. So it's still a very small snapshot. The more people that we can get filling out that survey, the greater the data set that we have, the more powerful it is. And we use that data to show that things are working, which encourages people to keep doing them. It helps us show where there's work still needs to be done, where there's still issues. We change the survey kind of year on year, and we expand it, as things come up as they're needed. But we put in more questions this year about inclusion, rather than just being what is your ethnicity, what is your gender. So this year, if people said that they had a disability, we then asked them if their employer made reasonable adjustments for their disability, and if they felt that their employer was inclusive. And we found that a fifth of disabled employees don't find that. So we kind of published that, and we're publishing next week for the first time the survey, the report, has been white and non-white in terms of ethnicity, about how we've looked at the data. And next week we're going to be publishing the breakdown, a more detailed breakdown into Black, Asian, mixed race and other. And that's so important because you can't just say the experience of all people who are non-white in the music industry is exactly the same. It just doesn't serve the purpose that we're all kind of working towards anymore. It just doesn't help. So we're committed to publishing more data, to publishing more granular data, so that we get a more accurate picture of people's experience within the industry, and then we can therefore help drive change and improve inclusion and all that sort of thing. But if you are in the music industry and you see us put out a call for the diversity survey, please do fill it out, because it's really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely, because the more information we have, the more we're going to be able to understand patterns, trends, or ways that we can actually move forwards and fix some of the problems that are so rooted within our industry. So, for instance, Katie, what are some of the other resources that can be used to promote a culture of inclusion?
Good question. I think social media is a huge one, because, I think I'm in the minority. The way that people react when I tell them I'm not on social media, they're mind blown. So I feel like the majority of people are on social media, so we have access to all the people that we need to reach. So we really should be utilising that as much as possible, not just in the run-up to an event or a festival of the countdown and the exciting stuff, but to actually use it as more of a communication channel. It's a great resource, and from the several years that I've been doing it, people tend to be really willing to help because they realise that it's a systemic problem, and they want to help change because they want it better for themselves, their friends, their peers, their children, their parents, whoever it is that's attending these events. And a lot of people do know someone that there's a reason that they don't want to go to an event or can't attend an event. So having the channels like the online things really has opened up so much, and we just need to make sure that we keep using the change that has been forced upon us, because nobody likes change. It's uncomfortable, right? And so the fact that we have changed so much now, and we've proved our resilience to this incredible change, as long as we keep using that, I think it will keep driving the change, hopefully.
Absolutely. And even though you said you don't use social media personally, I do remember when we spoke before that you mentioned that there were so many Facebook groups, and that I thought was very interesting. So if people aren't familiar, or they're trying to find a way that they can reach out to people, you said that there were Facebook groups for just about anything.
Anything. I was sending informations and questions to things like autism groups, people with assistance dogs, owner-trained assistance dogs, which is a completely huge but niche group in itself. Of if you can think of it, there's a group on Facebook for it, and there are people that want to give you the answers to the questions that you have, because it means that they can attend or make it their experience a smoother experience. It might not be the same as everyone's, because everyone's experience is different, but for them it would make it a more enjoyable experience. And I think that's what we're doing, right, is we're putting on events for people to enjoy themselves, essentially. And yeah.
And something that we mentioned before as well is that as event managers, we need to understand how we can implement change, but often it's unfortunately considered as a bit more of an afterthought, or when you're at the event and you see something and then you think, oh, that could have been done better. And sometimes it's a bit of a tick box. We've done that. So how do we avoid that scenario?
100%. I feel like the tick box is a really good way to describe it, because we think, oh, we've got a ramp, we're accessible, done. But only 5% of people who identify as disabled are wheelchair users, and it's only 3% of that 5% are full-time wheelchair users. So having a ramp doesn't really help the majority of people who are looking for disabled access. So I think we do need to do more in the planning and bringing it into making sure that accessibility is part of the initial stages, to make sure that we are planning an event for every kind of group, to make sure that we are as accessible as we can be, and making sure that it is part of the planning rather than an afterthought is so important.
Yeah. And of course, work needs to be accelerated. I think we can say that in the UK we are, having worked at quite a lot of festivals in different countries, and even just, I think this is a bit wider than just events, but restaurants or public places, parks, I don't know, whatever it is. I think in the UK we are very forward. I think we do good work compared to...
In comparison to other countries.
So I spent half of my life in France, and it is very different in France. Their idea of accessibility is nowhere near where we are, and yet there's still so much more to be done, and things are evolving quickly. But Alex, what are some of the small steps that we can take to help implement better practices within events?
I guess recognizing the difference between people. I've got diabetes, and it's a chronic illness, and when I have to use the disabled toilet to change my sensor or whatever I've got going on, people, not everything can be seen. So, and I always get the stare, why is she using the disabled toilet? But I have something, that I need to, it's not always able to be done in just the toilets that all public people use. And just kind of educating yourself and doing the research, and like Rachel was saying, that we all have unconscious bias, and it does really show when, I have experiences when people are looking at me for doing a certain thing, but educating yourself, doing the research, and just trying to recognize that there are differences between us all, and we are not all the same. And I guess some of the smaller things that you can do is just sort of speaking to people and finding out what they have got going on in their kind of everyday lives, because when I've done that, I found out a lot about just my friends, family, my colleagues, just little things about their health and their accessibility events that they've done, and small practices that they've implemented for other stuff that's been outside of the workplace. I didn't even know about ramps, to be completely honest with you, before I started working on festival stuff and larger events. I am not a wheelchair user, and it's not something that ever crossed my mind. So those are the smaller things that you can do. Like if you speak to people, have that dialogue and say, okay, what can we do to implement this? And I know a lot of things come across tick boxy, but sometimes you do have to think, okay, what do I have and what don't I have? Like I need to do the research and work out, okay, have we got a ramp? Yes. Is it actually an accessible ramp though? Like, because like you were saying before, can you use the ramp? Like, the roadies are pushing the equipment up the ramp. That's not good enough for someone who's a wheelchair user. So you have to really educate yourself and do the research.
Absolutely. And so coming back to PA tickets, that's something that we briefly talked about, but would you like to go a bit more into PA tickets?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a huge pusher for PA tickets as part of Attitude is Everything. Actually, I think are part of the ticketing coalition, and if you have a spare minute, do look into it, because a lot of things that naturally I assumed before I really started looking into it would think having to prove your disability, having to send in evidence is that's really invasive, that's really intrusive, and why should I have to do that? But then when you speak to people who actually use the service, it's really important to have some kind of process to go through. To prove is not really a nice word, because a lot of people, especially with invisible disabilities, you get asked to prove a lot of stuff. But there's so many schemes now with the access pass that can just show you with symbols what your access requirements are, so you don't have to know any intrusive details about someone's health, but you know what their access requirements are. Things like that I think are really important, because if you don't have those in place, it does get abused. Once people catch on, unfortunately, there are people in our society who do abuse the system, and as much as we like to think it doesn't happen, it does. And to have those, just sending a picture of your access card that says +1 at the bottom, or a picture of a toilet, or a queue to show you can't wait in queues, to have that there that stops the abuse, but it means that everybody that needs to access that can, it opens up a lot more for the people who, there's always a good story that we spoke about with Attitudes Everything at the Ticketing Coalition in 2018, I think it was, and they were saying there was a lady who came on stage and she was giving her experience about getting PA tickets, and she said that this drunk person came up and was like, "Hey, nice one, you got the 2 for 1 as well, did you?" And was just drunk, and she was really offended, because she was like, "No, I rely on this service, and you're abusing it." And to have the provisions in place to stop that abuse for the people that rely on it is really important. So it's not just hand out free tickets to everyone that asks for one. It's making sure that you have the system in place to be able to do it professionally, so that it's not abused, but also the people that require that service can access it.
Absolutely agreed. And so, Rachel, going back to talking about how to best promote inclusion within the teams of people working in events, how can that be done in a way that really promotes that culture and then is reflected at the events?
So I think probably the best way to kind of try and promote that inclusion is to try and create a culture in which people aren't afraid to speak up. As you were saying, you might not necessarily want to walk into me and be like, "Hi, I have all these this is my health history, and this is what and I'm part of the LGBT community," or whatever it may be that people can't necessarily tell about you. So it's creating a culture in which people feel comfortable enough to have that conversation with a superior or a colleague or whoever it may be, or if something's made them feel uncomfortable, to be able to speak about that without feeling like you're going to get punished, and to make sure that if someone's coming to you with a comment or about something that they've experienced, like, don't take that as a personal affront. You know, if someone comes to you and said, I don't feel as, you know, as a woman or as a person of colour or as a disabled person, I don't feel included here, that's not a personal attack. That don't punish them for it. You know, so it's about creating an environment in which people are okay to speak to their superior or their colleagues about the things that they've experienced and to make suggestions of how to improve it and to, not take it as an affront.
Yeah, I agree. It's so important because, of course, without diversity, ideas are never going to evolve, things aren't going to change. And I always think, you know, if you've got just one group of people, whether it's men, women, whatever, this comes back more to gender, but I always find working in lots of different teams, if you have just a purely male team, it's always going to be a certain way, whereas if you have, again, purely female, that is in itself has problems. And I always think the mixture, and that is representative of the wider issues and different ethnic minorities, people that have different ideas are going to bring something different to the table, and that's how we're going to evolve. And so I think that is just, it's so important. And instead of maybe talking about the negatives, and this is when approaching how to discuss it within teams, instead of saying, well, these are all the negative things, it's almost better to speak about the positive things and talk about, well, look, we wouldn't have got here if we hadn't had this idea. And sometimes highlighting the positives maybe will say more in people's minds. And that's definitely how ideas can be created. But Casey, how do you think the events industry, so our teams and our companies and the events core teams, how does it compare with other industries? Are we doing well? Other industries, is there an industry that leads by example?
I mean, I've had a dabble in a few other industries. Like, you know, I'm sure as a lot of people who worked in events do, when you have a quiet season, you pick up a few things here and there. And I think we are definitely doing well in the whole making sure that we're talking about it and trying, just in comparison to like hospitality or like from a worker's point of view. I think we're doing pretty well in the discussions, but whether there's enough being done for the customers, I'm not 100% sure on that in the other industries, because when a new hotel is being built or you know, a new bar is being constructed, they are able to put those permanent fixtures in place, and typically the accessibility, just talking on accessibility, it typically can be better because it's a permanent structure, and it's usually a little easier when you're building something that's going to be there permanently, because you put a lift in and you know that it's going to be used, you know, whereas sometimes in the middle of a field there is limited things that you can do. But also on like events in like listed buildings and stuff, it can be really difficult, because if you can't install like a stair lift, then you know there isn't much that we can do about it, and that is really frustrating. But we then have to try and think of new ways to do that. And I think with, as we were speaking earlier, with the technology that's evolved now, we're running out of excuses now to make it as accessible as it can be, because we have the tools and the resources now, and we have the mindset to go, okay, well, what can we do then if we can't do this? A good example I always think about with the theatres is when I was in school and I studied A-level dance, and we were studying a choreographer, and theatre tickets are expensive for a student who was working part-time, and we had to go and see a show for my exam, and we couldn't get into London, and we were only in Hertfordshire, but we couldn't get into London to see this theatre show, and they put it on in a chain of cinema, and it was across the whole world, the whole country, where that cinema chain was, and we could watch the show live, and we had the interval as if we were there, but we were sat in a cinema, and for me personally, as a student, I was like, brilliant, half-price tickets. I get to go to the cinema that's only a mile down the road. But actually, when you think about that from an accessibility point of view, that then opens the door to so many people, because the new cinemas are accessible. Like in theatre, if you only have 2 wheelchair spaces, there are only 2 wheelchair spaces, and there is nothing that can be done in that theatre. But if it is then put on in all of the cinemas across the country, then all of the cinemas that have all of those wheelchair spaces, all of those people that can't get a ticket because the show's sold out or whatever reason, they can't get into London because TfL isn't always very accessible, etc., etc. To be able to go to your local cinema and watch the show that you weren't able to get to before, like, is incredible. And that means that we can then have like BSL interpreters or on the screen, or what did you call them? Subtitles? Okay, head of accessibility, can't remember subtitles. And it does open up things like, you know, being able to have an autism-friendly showing. It just, the possibilities are endless when we just step back and think of what else we can do.
Absolutely. I think there's been some really interesting insights that you lovely ladies were able to provide, so thank you so much. And I'd just like to just very quickly just give a few takeaways in a similar way to yesterday, and just remembering about, I think, empathy, putting yourself, I think that was what resonated with me personally the most, and I think that's probably the case for lots of people, and that's just one thing that can be done, is just trying to imagine and try and put yourself in the shoes of someone else. So thank you all so much for attending, and enjoy the rest of the show.